Hi, and welcome to the Luminaries In and Out of Sect podcast, a show about the moon and how astrologers embody and relate to it. My name is SP Hall, and I'm your host. In today's episode on the Aries Moon as the Sect Light, I speak with the astrologer Tony of the Woods. We talk about the placement of his moon on the Midheaven in the 10th whole sign house, but we also talk about many other things, such as the challenges of having the moon in a hot, dry sign, druidism and Ogham, the moon's role in Islam, the story of Jason and Medea and the Golden Fleece, the philosophy of Alfred Whitehead, the difference between fate and destiny, and Lunar Mansions and their remedies. As always, if you enjoy the work that I'm doing, please contribute to the podcast's sustainability by becoming a supporting member or offering a one-time donation on my website. There, you can also find information on my services. I'm offering natal and horary consultations on a donation basis, as well as transcription, captioning, and audio editing. Thanks again to all those that have offered their generous support. Appreciate you. Now for my conversation with Tony. I hope you enjoy it. Please be sure to check out the links to his website and socials below, as well as links to some of the resources that we touch on in our conversation. All right, Tony, thank you so much for being with me today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, and thanks for having me.
It is my pleasure. My pleasure. So let's get into the conversation with you giving us a brief introduction to yourself, your practice, your influences, teachers you've had, and just how you think about astrology in general.
Sure. I go by Tony. I use the handle Tony of the Woods, something I just came up with. A little bit about myself. I grew up in southern Indiana in like a working class family. Um, was always kind of very bookish, and then in high school got deeply into like spirituality and occultism, and kind of what started my journey. That was back in around 2006, 2007. Also, first experienced astrology at its fullest around that time, kind of getting full idea of what a chart is. Although the funny thing is, my moon placement was what kind of turned me off around astrology at that time, and we'll probably get into that a little bit as we explore that and my
Can you
history
give
with
us
the moon.
a quick summary, really quick? Like, what about your moon placement
Sure.
threw
Well, I
you
always
off?
felt kind of like watery, I guess, like on the creative side, emotional. And then when learning, I might have an Aries moon versus a Pisces moon that just didn't feel right at the time,
Mm,
um, despite the moon being so high in the chart in the 10th house. It just didn't feel like part of me. Um, Now, after having lived much more life, I'm definitely an Aries moon in a lot of
mm,
ways. But I guess just at that time, it didn't adhere to my view of myself. I felt like a Cancer rising, which I am, or some of my water placements. And so, without knowing and having like a specific birth time on a birth certificate, that just kind of held me back a little bit from studying astrology until several years later when I got more confirmation of the time and again kind of lived more of life to where everything felt aligned a bit more. And then I got much more deeply into astrology. So
mm.
yeah.
And did you rectify your birth time with an astrologer, or were you able to get a birth certificate?
I didn't get a birth certificate specifically, but I got had one of those like baby pillows that are made like right around when the baby is born, and
Mm-hmm.
it said 9:45 p.m., which does sound a bit rounded. So I would like to explore rectification a bit more in the future, but it does closely match what my mom said,
Mm-hmm.
and her memory has been good for my two sisters as well.
Yeah.
So I felt pretty good about that after finding that pillow and yeah.
Yeah, I definitely understand that. I got my birth certificate to like confirm my birth time, and my mom was off by like 20 minutes, something like that. So it wasn't uh, any major change. Like my ascendant degree changed by a few degrees, but other than that, like, moms know, like she was,
Yeah. My
some of
mom
them,
has a heavy
do.
Virgo placement. She's a Virgo rising with
Oh,
Sun in Virgo.
so your
So
mom definitely
yeah.
knows. Your mom definitely knows. Cool. Yeah. So you learned your moon placement. You had some friction around that. So let's get back into that. Where did you kind of go from there?
Yeah, so in my sort of spiritual exploration, that kind of came to the fore. And while astrology was set aside, I was still very much so into like occultism and esotericism and all sorts of religious traditions. I sort of just soaked it up. Ended up going to college for linguistics,
Mm,
which is interesting because astrology is often analogized to learning a language,
mm,
which definitely feels right for me. And but yeah, over those, I guess, 15 years, I was just absorbing a lot of the same symbolism that is used in astrology, like through tarot and various occult traditions. I guess druidry is one that I've always been drawn to.
mm,
Um, so by the time I fully got to like I guess catching the astrology bug in 2021, I was sort of ahead where I had a lot of experience with the symbolism of the planets and the sort of philosophy and history associated with the tradition. So it was just more of filling in the technique and getting into practicing more so. So yeah, that's kind of been my experience with astrology. And as far as like my personal philosophy goes, that sort of developed along that same timeline. It's evolved over the years, but it's definitely taken a kind of animistic relational approach, which is becoming more and more popular these days, which is great to see.
mm-hmm,
Basically, seeing everything as alive and as a person, um, as a way of interacting with the world, but also letting the world be what it is and experiencing that like a phenomenological approach,
mm-hmm,
to where in the past I would might look at the moon, for example, and think, oh well, what does that mean? Or is it just a rock floating in the sky that's been sort of assigned meanings by human cultures, um, or, or like what is going on with it? And now I feel a lot more comfortable with staring at the moon and letting her be what she is,
mm-hmm,
and um, having giving legitimacy to the feelings and thoughts caused within me, but when interacting with, thinking about, looking at the moon, or
mm,
any other quote unquote object or being. So yeah, kind of granting legitimacy to every experience, every moment, and allowing the
mm,
meaning to unfold from that interaction is something that's kind of grown more and more for me. And like letting that intellectual questioning take a backseat to experience.
mm,
Still there, obviously. I have a pretty well a conflicted Mercury, I guess, but one
mm,
that loves digging in and like thinking deeply about things. Um, but yeah, like letting that experience kind of come to the fore is important. And kind of connected to that is I'm very much so a neophyte, but I've been very interested since I've learned about it is process philosophy, that was kind of started by Alfred Whitehead.
okay,
Um, Kind of not one of the most popular philosophical approaches because it delved deeply into the metaphysical side of things, which sort of
mm,
went out of popularity in the English speaking world for
mm,
quite a
yeah,
while. But he kind of devised a whole metaphysical system of moments basically where the I guess the smallest particles are essentially moments of experience. And it gets more complicated than that, and in a very interesting way that brings in like Platonism and re-envisioning what like the ideal forms or archetypes are and how they interact with like human experience.
mm-hmm,
But yeah, it's a very interesting system that I've kind of been learning more and more about and incorporating more into my thought. But yeah, that's kind of where I'm at now philosophically, and we could touch on more on the spirituality side of things later or whenever you think is appropriate too. But
yeah,
yeah,
that'd be wonderful. Yeah, I love that. I just wanted to say you kind of talked about coming into astrology not late, but a little bit later, and how things that you learned before that were of service to your learnings in astrology or being an astrologer. And I just wanted to echo that because I studied philosophy in college, and I feel like that's really prepared me well to think about the foundations of astrology because they're philosophical, they're rooted in philosophical thought, and so having a knowledge of Plato and Aristotle and the way that ideas evolved over time, the history of philosophy has really served me to better understand astrology and its changes over time. And yeah, one of the things I'm not actually that familiar with Whitehead, but I know of the kind of schism that you're talking about in the English speaking world compared to what's analytic philosophy compared to continental philosophy, the phenomenological approach on the continent of Europe that you're describing. And I do think that those questions really are at the forefront of my mind when thinking about the astrological system or just like doing the more technical things with astrology. And we don't need to get super into that, but I just wanted to put that forward as like everything that you do in life can help you to get to where you want to go or where you're heading. It's kind of like there are diversions, but there are no diversions, that kind of idea. And so I kind of really appreciate you sharing that a little bit about your studies and your spiritual evolution, your philosophical changes that you've made over time. I feel like that really speaks to that.
Yeah, and that's also something that's taken me a while to integrate too, is allowing that, like all of my previous experience to inform where I'm at now. But the more and more I do it, the more I feel in tune, I guess, with what's going on, where I'm at in my path, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, can you share a bit about how we know each other? I will say that we know each other from Twitter, and I think we've both kind of like I've appreciated the support that you've given this podcast and the support that you've given through like engaging with my questions and my kind of thoughts that I've put out there into the interwebs. But I don't know if you have any additional things that you'd like to share about that. Would love to hear if
Sure.
so.
Yeah, through Twitter is how we got to know each other. Like you said, I had seen that you were posting a lot of material on branches of astrology that I'm also interested in,
Mm-hmm.
traditional broadly, and then Hellenistic. I also noticed you post stuff about medieval philosophy, whether the Islamic side of things or later European. Um, and so that's also been my main focus. And I realized I didn't answer the question about astrology practice, but yeah, those are the fields that I like. But I also like a lot of people bring in stuff from the modern astrology. Um, I've really got started again, like a lot of people, with the astrology podcast and Chris
Mm-hmm.
Brennan. Um, that's his synthesis that he's kind of putting forward, and also just bringing in lots of guests from many strains of astrology has been influential for me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I haven't had like direct teachers. I've used like tons of books and podcasts and talks, and that's also something that caused me to get started a bit more slowly, like interacting on social media and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Just not wanting to like present the wrong information or anything. Considered that I've started pretty recently in the late 2021,
Mm-hmm.
but as I've interacted with other astrologers and learned more, I've kind of gotten more confident. I still sort of present myself as a student and
Yeah.
definitely in the practicing stage, but I also find it's good when people are able to share and their learnings as they go, and that's what I've
Mm-hmm.
been focusing on. So yeah, again, as far as teachers, like the material from like Demetra George has been huge, and several others. I really like the Benjamin Dykes translations as well.
Mm-hmm.
Have those like stacked around me a lot of
Nice.
times. But yeah, didn't have much more to say on those. Um, would you like me to expand on
No, I
those?
just wanted to say I know that a lot of people are intimidated by Twitter, but I will say that I think if you frame yourself as someone that's learning, like you and I have, because I also consider myself still like a student, like not even really a year into being a student of astrology. So I think that, if you frame yourself in a certain way and you come with some like humility and a desire to actually converse and learn, that can go a long way. Of course, there are people who are bad faith actors or are unkind. That just happens. But everyone's free to use the block button if they want to. I've not done it a ton, but I've of course done it a few times because some weirdness can go on. It's okay to have boundaries. But I also want to just give a shout out to like the importance of actually practicing the things that you're learning. Like I've been influenced by Dimitri's books as well, and I've used them on my own chart, but it's really taken my knowledge and my studies to a new level by doing trades with other student astrologers or professional astrologers. And so I think the catalyst for having you on the podcast is you were looking to do trades with other folks, and I was in the same boat. I had done a few trades at that point, and so I reached out to you, and yeah, we were able to kind of apply those techniques to another person's chart and get some feedback. And I think that that's a really powerful tool for relatively new students of astrology. And so I definitely encourage people like, develop some relationships with people and try to work with others in a reciprocal way so that you can help each other kind of like build your knowledge and build your skills. So just wanted to give a shout out to that before I before I forget.
Oh yeah, I would definitely second that. I mean, social media might not be for everyone because of its addictive tendencies and a lot of the negativity that's sort of
Mm,
wrapped up into it. But if you are a person who thinks that they can withstand those, it's a great opportunity to sort of kind of have that immersion experience that I've heard a few
mm-hmm,
people talk about that applies to learning a language, but astrology as well. The more you can kind of interact with people who speak the same language, in this case, the astrological language of astrological symbolism, like the more it can kind of become ingrained. At the same time, you sort of have to have a filter of knowing who are your reliable sources within that
right.
and who you might want to kind of, keep an arm's length. And so kind of having that almost like, I guess I've been in branding quite a bit in
Mm,
my sort of, I guess, professional experience. Um, and so whether or not I sit down and make a branding plan, I sort of think that way.
mm,
So even like with my at that point like sort of fun astrological social media accounts in the back of my mind I had like, okay, what's my approach and like my brand and what am I presenting, um, what legitimacy do I bring to what I'm presenting, and then what am I consuming and who am I interacting with, not necessarily to the most manipulative extent that that could be, but kind of having
mm-hmm,
that in mind is like, yeah, it's cool to hang out with people, but like what is my goal here, and that has
mm,
helped me kind of keep a bit more grounded and not like just melt all over Twitter and
yeah,
whatnot. Um,
yeah.
but yeah, and as far as the trades go, I would recommend that for anyone who is like getting into astrology. I wish I had done it a little earlier too, because I
Mm-hmm,
feel like I had enough like base level knowledge for like many months before I started doing trades. But that knowledge never really became activated until I started really doing readings.
mm-hmm,
It felt intimidating and still does, but I found I knew a lot more than I thought that I did, and I had a lot more to offer other people than I thought I did. And
mm-hmm,
I feel like I've kind of grown leaps and bounds these last few months, where I've done like at least one reading a week, either a trade or um, I'm offering readings. Like my books are open
mm-hmm.
to for like a kind of like a sliding scale since I'm a student. But yeah,
Right
highly
on.
recommend that for sure.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Okay, so moving on a little bit, when you think back to your childhood, what was your relationship to the moon at that time? And if maybe that's not super clear, like what's one memory maybe that comes to mind? from that time in relation to the moon.
Yeah, every time I think about this question, I get like kind of the tingles. It's interesting.
I love
I
that.
never had like some sort of crazy experience with the moon, but
Hmm.
it was always like this mysterious figure, like um, always changing, both like its moon phase and its shape, but also at that time, with my very poor astronomical knowledge,
Mm.
I could never really predict when it would be where in the sky. Like sometimes it would be up in the day, and sometimes it would be like high at night, and um, that just felt like a constantly shifting background. And then when I would look at the moon, I always remember like being fascinated by the splotches, like the dark
Mm.
patches, like the um, I'm sure I'm embarrassing myself. I don't know like the terminology of the
Those
landscape.
craters.
Yeah, but I noticed that they never seem to be in the same place. That like it always seemed to be sort of shifting, or at least my kind of experience of it. And to me,
Hmm.
they almost looked like shadow continents, kind of
Mm.
reflecting like the various continents you would see on the globe here. I'm just trying to
Can I
remember.
jump in really
Yeah,
quickly
please
just
do.
because like something that I really like love actually is if you go on Google Earth and you zoom out all the way, you'll be given options to like explore other planets,
Oh wow.
which I think is super cool. And you can go and look at the moon and you can see like all of the different craters and stuff, and like they have all these cool names like the Sea of Tranquility, and like I can't think of any of the other names, but they're just like these super cool like kind of epic names for these parts of the moon. And you can do this with other things, like I think you can do it with Vesta. You can do it with different planets and stuff like that, maybe perhaps like the moons of Jupiter, because I know that Jupiter has like a ton of moons. Super, super cool. I didn't realize I don't know why I was like messing around on Google Earth one day and figured it out that you could like go to another planet on Google Earth. But yeah, you just reminded me of that. And I was like really excited when I figured it out.
I love that. I wrote it down to like as soon as we hang up. I think I'm gonna do that.
Nice.
But yeah, so just like the mystery of it. One specific memory was actually a lunar eclipse
Mm,
happened. I don't know if I'm smushing together memories, although that's kind of a lunar thing.
very lunar thing. Yeah.
But I do remember uh, we were like fishing at night, me and my then stepdad. It's like catfishing, which I think is done more at night. Not my thing, but you know, at that time I was doing that. And I remember
Hmm.
there was a lunar eclipse, and uh, we kind of stopped to watch it as it got exact. And of course, the moon turns like blood red, and it's almost like it has this feeling of like awe, where it's like really
Mm,
cool, but almost like I get why people are afraid of eclipses, because at the moment it just feels very eerie. And this is
mm,
just a lunar eclipse, let alone a solar eclipse. I just remember that being very kind of impactful at the time. I
mm,
couldn't explain why, but it just seemed significant.
mm. I'm getting the image of my mind of like you and your stepdad. I don't know, you're in a, I don't know if you were in a boat, but it feels like a very lunar thing to kind of like paint this picture, like in the canoe on on the lake or on the pond or something with like the moon overhead at night, turning like slowly being eclipsed and turning red. It feels very picturesque, very kind of, yeah, there's a kind of, not to use the word epic again, but there's a kind of like cinematic quality to it almost. That's
Yeah,
very cool.
yeah, I think it was on the shore, but I mean, I've done canoeing and we had rowboats and stuff, and
Hmm.
yeah, and like there's also a tension there too, because my relationship with my stepdad was complicated
Mm,
and had very like Martian intense like anger moments as well.
yeah.
Uh, so I think it is a good kind of encapsulation overall of my moon experience of maybe mixing memories together, confusion, but also
Mm,
like this kind of picturesque and um, kind of combined with an outdoors experience.
mm.
Yeah, it was just that's kind of one of the images that came to mind.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I hope that we can kind of delve more into those emotional dynamics and kind of like how that shows up astrologically a bit in your chart too. because I do think there's there's a lot going on in your chart, especially with the moon, because she's right on the MC. She's ruling your ascendant, aspecting so many planets in your chart. And so, I think that there's like a lot of richness there to explore.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I took some notes on that.
Wonderful. So what does the moon mean for you today, and why do you think it's important that we focus on the moon when we're talking about astrology?
Sure. Well, I do like a lot of the traditional descriptions of the moon, of it being the body that's closest to the earth and kind of reflecting the light of the spirit of the sun,
Mm-hmm.
but kind of bringing it to the earthly level, embodying it.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of just take that sort of basic philosophical idea and sort of run with it. And I do like the cyclical nature and how it's tied in with the tides, and it's really a good entry way too into the astrology. I
Mm-hmm.
find that as I do more readings, I like to start with the moon phase. It's very, you can look up in the sky and see it, and everyone has an experience of it, whether or not they've thought about astrology or astronomy beyond that. So it's kind of a good sort of starter, I think. And at the same time, the depth of the moon, like you could stay talking about the moon for multiple readings or your entire life.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I feel that. Uh, and as far as like my personal kind of connection with the moon today, um, I don't have like a specific lunar practice, but I
Mm-hmm.
do, as much as I can, do like a daily planetary prayer. And
Mm-hmm.
I've used different prayers for this, and I found that the simplest that I keep it, the better.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it can be like a pain to stick to it. But for
Right.
sure, on Mondays, I try to get a prayer out, light a candle and incense. I've used the Orphic hymns, and those are good.
Mm-hmm.
One of these days, I'd like to write my own because I like
Mm.
that experience.
Yeah.
Um, but that has been, I think that is really what got me into astrology, actually. Side note is I started doing the planetary prayers maybe like in 2018 on and
Okay.
off. And then a few years later is when I got into astrology. And I just feel like the energy of that, or there's some sort of connection or momentum being established that then once that I sort of delved a little bit into astrology, got sucked fully in. Um,
Mm. That's really interesting. If you kind of touched on this already, forgive me, but how did you end up saying the or doing the planetary prayers without being into astrology already? Because I feel like I've moved more into like planetary practices and like saying Orphic hymns like as a result of learning a bit about astrology and my astrology journey. So I'm really curious how you ended up in that place.
sure, it was part of my journey of trying to move away from like armchair occultism, which can
Mm,
definitely be my tendency since high school. Uh, I have a strong Scorpio, and like all of the kind of secrecy associated with Scorpio, and I have some other placements that account for that. Those have kind of kept me from really diving deeply, and
mm,
over the years, I've been wanting to like break into practice more so and in different traditions, but somewhere along the way, I found the recommendation to do planetary prayers just because of how central the planets are, especially to some like Western quote unquote forms of like occultism,
mm,
esotericism, spirituality, and like I said, I've had a connection with the planets even without like an astrological practice. Um, like some of the other practices involved like various forms of meditation and like divination, like tarot,
mm-hmm.
or the Ogham, which is like a druid form of sortilege.
Yeah.
But yeah, like the prayers just seemed like a good way to connect to like a set of energies or forces or archetypes that is like a consistent system. There's seven that sort of represent everything within our experience, which
Mm-hmm.
felt kind of complete without like an oversimplification, which sometimes like a singular focus on the divine can feel like. I have a
Mm-hmm.
complicated relationship with like monotheism versus polytheism. But
Yeah, tell me about it.
yeah, like I guess to go back a little bit
By that I
then.
mean I also have a complicated relationship, you know?
Cool. Yeah, cool. Well, I guess just to give a quick overview on that, from like some point in my childhood up until high school, I had become like Protestant Christian.
Mm-hmm.
Of like my grandmother took me and my sisters to church, and I decided to get more involved with that myself. But I quickly burned out on that, where I didn't
Mm-hmm.
feel like I was getting enough spirituality from it. I could see some other people would, like, getting really intensely involved in like prayer and like worship singing and having what looked to be intense experiences, which I just didn't get.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so that, and then my interest in like occultism, which is a no-no, and then my sexuality, which I'm like a gay male, I like sort of grew into that and accepted that for myself. All those things sort of kind of pulled me away from the mainstream Christianity, and so
Yeah.
I left that. And then in high school, up until my 20s, I was just sort of in like a searching phase and learning many religions and spiritual traditions and kind of research into occultism. And then, but I never really like adhered to anything. I do remember doing some sort of prayer to the moon, but in like a very idiosyncratic way of like choosing like a some sort of moon god, like a male moon figure,
Mm.
and but that never really went anywhere. But that is a lunar thing, so it's definitely relevant. But yeah, then into my 20s, still interested in many things, but I did kind of go more. I basically became a Muslim as sort of
Mm-hmm.
one of my spiritual traditions, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And that too, I came about it in a very idiosyncratic way, for sure. And it's like my own experience. I'm definitely not like a, I guess you could say, standard Muslim, but I do feel a lot of
Mm-hmm.
nourishment from the tradition and the structure of the prayers and whatnot. Really felt good.
Mm.
And at the same time, I got into like the animism and druidry as different traditions. So, kind of exploring all of that has been the experience since my 20s. Um, and now coming to astrology, I feel like it's kind of tying everything together because astrology has always been a big part of the Muslim world,
Mm-hmm.
and has always been a part of the Western sort of occult tradition, which includes Druidry, and now animism as it kind of as the Western quote unquote again tradition sort of makes contact again with the rest of the world on a more equal basis, is when I feel like those kind of animistic worldviews are kind of becoming more um, explored,
Mm-hmm.
and so yeah, astrology I feel like kind of ties all those together nicely.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks so much for explaining that. I think one thing I want to say really quickly about Ogham is I wanted to give a shout out quickly to the Irish pagan school. That's how I learned about Ogham. I have Irish heritage, and so I've been particularly interested in like pre-Christian Irish spirituality as far as that's accessible. It's kind of difficult because that goes back pretty far in history. But yeah, I took their like introduction to Irish magic or something like that, their class, and I'll link that in the show notes. But they touch on Ogham a little bit there. Um, the other thing I wanted to say is like I think since our trade, I've been thinking about our conversation therein about you and Islam, and just thinking about how important the moon is in Islam. Just if you look at flags for like largely Muslim countries, there's like always like a crescent moon. Maybe not always, but several countries have crescent moons on their flags, and I just think that's really interesting. And I don't know if you could touch on at all like the importance of the moon in Islam, if there is a real emphasis on it religiously. But I'm really interested in that.
Sure. Well, I can touch on it, although I'll just say what my experience has been and what my knowledge is.
Cool.
One thing for sure is that the Islam or the Muslims use a lunar calendar for the
Mm,
reckoning of like various religious holidays such as Ramadan. And what's interesting is a lot of people use a calculated timing for that. Um, but the tradition that I'm in specifically it is required that someone sees the first sliver of the crescent of the moon, and that is then the beginning of the lunar month.
Mm.
So there's always the kind of question, especially around like when Ramadan begins, is like, oh, did they see the moon or not, and whether it's going to be within like a 1 to 3 day range. And
Mm-hmm.
there's like a whole list of criteria, and so for sure that's a big part of the tradition. Another thing that's interesting too, like another calendrical thing, is that a lot of times if you get a like a Muslim calendar, printed calendar, it will list when the moon is in Scorpio as a
Mm.
specific time to sort of like not do anything. And
Wow.
and now being an astrologer, I realized that the moon is in detriment in Scorpio, and like there are some other things like the Via Combusta, where the moon is just uncomfortable
Mm-hmm.
there. And there's no other astrological thing really mentioned. It's just I think it would be Hamar in the Krab is like, and that translates to moon in Scorpio. I had to ask what that meant.
Wow.
So that's just an interesting little anecdote.
That's
Uh,
so interesting.
yeah, and I'm sure there's a lot more. Like there's a lot to there's like a whole systems of like spiritual astrology, like from Ibn Arabi in particular, that I want to delve a little deeper into myself. But yeah, like the moon has always been important, and like astrologically, a lot of times Islam as a religion has been equated with the planet Venus, um,
Mm.
for a lot of reasons. And then like the holiest day being Friday,
Mm.
versus like the solar Christian Sunday, and
Right.
the Jewish Sabbath associated with Saturn
Mm-hmm.
on Saturday, and like that makes a lot of sense in a lot of ways. But the moon is very close to like the Muslim experience, just because of that experiential calendar. Like it's not just Ramadan; it's every month is set by the moon sighting,
Mm.
and then you'll always have certain holidays all always around the same moon phase, and that calendar isn't tied to the solar calendar, so it actually moves backwards 11 days every year.
Okay.
So there's like a long cycle where Ramadan will be in summer for many years, and then it will slowly go back into spring and then the winter.
Mm-hmm.
So that's interesting.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Cool. Thanks for explaining that. So, what does the sign of Aries mean to you? And in addition to that, how do considerations of myth play into your understanding and experience of both the moon and the sign of Aries?
Sure. So with Aries kind of being the cardinal fire sign, and it's really the first in the series, it to me, I mean, it just has that like burst of energy, that beginning feeling. Um, and to me, Aries is the most, I guess, easy to understand sign. Maybe that's because of my moon placement, but like that feeling of like having that sudden beginning or like explosion of energy is just kind of makes a lot of sense to me. And so it's like
Mm-hmm.
fast, quick to start, or like the image of a spring is one that I like, where it's like
Mm-hmm.
compressed and then it bursts open, and like the energy is then quickly expended, and then it needs to be sort of like compressed back down before it can then burst again. And that's definitely how it feels, where it's like I can like have a lot of energy and be excited and start a project, and then I need to kind of regenerate that excitement, or else it might jump to something else. It definitely has like that jumping from starting ideas to starting another idea to starting another idea. It's
Mm-hmm.
like the cardinal of cardinal, or the most tropical of the tropical signs
Right.
is how it feels to me at least.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I totally get that.
And
And I
this
think even with Aries falling in like the fifth house in my chart, like going into doing this podcast, I very much had to like set goals of what I wanted it, like what success would look like, so that I felt like I would follow through because it felt like a big undertaking, like a big deal for me to undertake this project. And so I was like, I want to at least complete the year. Like I want to complete the whole kind of cycle so that I do every moon sign, so that like it wasn't like I'm going to start and then I get distracted and I'll move on to something, another idea. So I can even kind of get that in my own chart. And I have Mars in my first house, and so I feel like Mars ruling the fifth, that kind of gets brought into maybe a bit more of like my embodiment or my identity, this kind of like creative style or what have you. So yeah, I definitely relate to that. Did you have anything else that you wanted to share about Aries?
Um, Not in general. I think more will come in when we bring in the moon placement
Cool.
part specifically.
So what does it mean for you for the moon to be in Aries, and are you comfortable sharing where that falls in your chart and how that impacts your experience of your moon?
Sure. Yeah, my moon is in the 10th house, pretty closely conjunct the MC. The moon is at 3 degrees Aries, and my MC is at 4 degrees. So it's right after that angular position, but it's still in that place where it's kind of goaded or still pretty closely conjunct.
Yeah.
Uh, and yeah, it's squaring Jupiter and then Saturn, Neptune, Venus, and Uranus,
Mm.
kind of including Cancer and Capricorn, and we can talk about those a little bit as we kind of come to that.
Yeah,
Um,
totally.
but yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on there with the moon
Hmm.
for sure. And the moon also rules my ascendant and is my sect light because I'm a night chart. So
Right.
definitely lunar person, really highlighting that Aries placement a lot for sure. And what that means to me in my experience, like a lot of the things that we associate with Aries, both good and bad, I feel like I have experienced or I embody in a lot of ways. From like that, like again, like energy bursting sort of feel, to even like having that quick flare of temper where it's like,
Mm.
uh, especially with like the people I'm closest with, might experience this more so than just like the general public,
Mm.
for better or worse, either on their behalf or unfortunately to them at my worst moments.
Yeah.
I can kind of get that like kind of burst of like frustration or irritability or even anger, but then it does go away quickly, like you would expect from like an Aries placement versus like that lingering scorpionic kind of grudge like anger that can
Hmm.
like I'm not completely empty of. I do have a lot of Scorpio placements, but just kind of like on a day-to-day basis, like the changing of emotions is quick and fast and intense. Whether it be anger, which is more kind of archetypically maybe Aries, but any emotion really tends to kind of peak and go in waves and be really intense,
Hmm.
um, almost unbearable at times. But
Yeah.
then it goes away and changes to something else very quickly. So like on the emotional level, there's that, and then on
Mm.
the physical level, like especially even in like the older texts, you'll see like Aries be like ruddy or red in the face, and that's definitely like you can't see me right now because it's a podcast, but my face is a bit flushed, and I even have like slightly reddishness to my like facial hair, especially when the sun is hitting it. So that's definitely kind of like on the nose for like a moon in Aries placement.
And for those listening, Tony's also wearing a red shirt. So it's like red yellow shirt. So it's kind of like also accentuating the redness of his skin as well. So it feels very fitting.
Yeah, and then like going a little further, there is like that like Aries is the ram, right? So there can be that like head butting energy sometimes where if, like I feel like I'm at odds with someone,
Mm.
it can like escalate and feel intense. I don't want to paint myself in a terrible light, but
Mm.
there's good uses of that energy and more negative uses, like with any. Um,
Right.
and then there's definitely like that, like independence, freedom kind of associations
Hmm.
are there for me as well, like politically and even just personally, where I like to be able to do things my own way, and I don't want to be isolated. But a lot of times, when it comes to like working or projects, I'll feel a lot more comfortable working independently.
Mm.
Yeah, and that's just a few things. Another thing that's physical is like headaches associated with
Mm.
Aries, and I do get those often,
Mm. Because
including
Aries, I forget the term for the medical astrology chart that refers to signs in different parts of the body, but Aries is connected with the head
Yep.
and
Like
fire and
anesthesia, something like that.
yes,
Something like
yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, definitely headaches, especially associated with heat. I found that like in the summer when it's really hot, if I'm not
Mm.
hydrating, I can get headaches for sure. Anything else that I wanted to quickly mention?
Yeah, I just
Uh,
want to quickly just kind of emphasize the point that on this podcast we're generally talking about the moon, but talking about the moon I think for you is ever more important because the moon rules your ascendant. So it's anybody looking at their chart, like the planet that rules your ascendant is the planet that kind of represents you. So the condition of that is going to tell you something about your constitution, perhaps your character, perhaps your physical um, morphology. I think the word would be like how your body is kind of constructed. And it's interesting because, and also like, correct me if I'm wrong, but like planets in the first house can kind of also speak to how the native embodies. And so, like, interestingly, we both have angular moons. Cancer plays an important part in both of our charts. So it's your first house. It's my eighth house. My I have a Sagittarius rising, and so Jupiter is in Cancer. Both of our Jupiters are in Cancer. So there adds this kind of Cancerian element to, or this Jupiterian element for you, and this Cancerian element for me. And then there's also like the moon is in Sag in my first house, and so we both have these fiery qualities, and so it's interesting fiery qualities with like our emotional nature and our embodiment, perhaps. And so it's interesting thinking back to the first episode of this podcast with Erin Tech Shipley, and she talked about like the buoyancy of the Sagittarius moon and how like emotions just kind of a good thing about it is that things will come and go very quickly. And I think that there's resonance with that, with what you're talking about with your Aries moon, this kind of cardinal nature of like fire and then just kind of a release of energy quickly. And so it's interesting to see that that commonality. I think the thing that's obviously different is the mutable nature of the Sagittarius moon and the double bodied nature. So I think for myself, and I'm interested to hear about like the emotional quality that you maybe consistently experience because I think I can hold a lot of different emotions. And so there's things moving in different directions, which feels very mutable, feels very double bodied, holding conflicting emotions at the same time and finding some type of acknowledging the truth in that. Do you feel like for you, there is more of that kind of single minded or single focused emotion that's kind of that comes and goes, or what does that look like for you?
uh, Absolutely, yeah. There's like one single emotion. It can switch, but it's really kind of one at a time is how it feels. And there's like
Mm,
a rawness to it, um,
mm,
where it's almost like there's an uncomfortability. Just like the moon isn't super comfortable in Aries. It's kind of peregrine,
mm-hmm.
and while my moon uh, sees its triplicity ruler Jupiter and then like participating triplicity ruler of Saturn, it doesn't see Mars, its ruler, although Mars is in Scorpio, which it rules. So there's this lichen girdled quality where
Mm-hmm.
um, the moon does have kind of a connection or a resonance with Mars, even though there's not an aspectual connection.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and side note, like learning astrology, I definitely like, delve deep into all the smaller connections just to kind of figure out my own chart. And I'm sure other people have that similar experience where it's like, wait, my moon seems screwed. How can it possibly not be screwed? But then like working to figure out what part of that is actually applicable versus
Mm-hmm.
wishful thinking has been part of a journey. But yeah, just kind of summarizing that emotional experience, I would kind of re-emphasize that raw quality because it's something that
Mm-hmm.
comes up with Aries, and it's definitely part of my experience where yes, it's like bursts, but they can be like uncomfortable. There's like a sharp edge to them, or just like a general kind of background. discomfort sometimes, even like
Mm-hmm.
physically or emotionally, where the more I engage with the body and like sink into my emotional experience, it feels better. But sometimes that the intensity or the raw sort of almost like survival feeling of it, where it's um, kind of touching upon that violence of Mars and
Mm-hmm.
Aries, where it almost feels like every moment is an act of violence in some way. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
it's yeah, I don't know if I'll be able to like really describe it more than that, but like there is a feeling to where like every moment is like bursting into existence, and I can like feel that at times.
Yeah.
And there is like a discomfort there, like a feeling of being on like the edge.
Yeah.
Um,
Sounds
does
like
seem
a strong vitality, but also with that comes real intensity, and that intensity can be difficult to embody.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, of course, for me, that's tempered by like that square from Saturn has like a cooling kind of frustrating influence, and then the square to Jupiter, which is in its exaltation, but still can have that like limiting quality as well. But yeah, at like the most peak Moon and Aries moments, it is that raw intensity, vitality, kind of life force energy,
Mm-hmm.
um, for sure. And then to kind of bring in the myth a little bit, I did have one which I've explored a little bit. I'd like to get into it a bit more, but a myth associated with Aries of Jason and the Golden Fleece.
Sure.
Uh,
Do you mind if I
especially,
ask one follow-up question
yeah, yeah.
about what you just talked about? Yeah, so other than presence, is there anything that you've found that's really helped you navigate that feeling of intensity or that feeling of discomfort that comes with can come perhaps with the Aries moon? I don't know how much these other factors play into that, but I was wondering if you could maybe share some suggestions for some people who are listening right now and resonating with that experience and maybe need some help with the mitigation of it or kind of coming into more of a comfort with the discomfort. If that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. And yeah, this is something I'm just kind of exploring myself.
Mm-hmm.
Really just dipped my toes in so far. But some things that like just the beginning of have helped are exploring like this somatic meditation,
Mm.
which is kind of a can be summarized as a more extensive version of like sinking into the body in the moment and exploring that as a form of meditation.
Mm.
That like my explorations there have helped quite a bit. And that just like connecting with the breath. I mean, it's a very simple meditative like recommendation,
Yeah.
but at the same time, it's really effective for me, at least to a certain extent, of telling myself to breathe more deeply, bring more air into my lungs, because sometimes I just get that like I guess breathless feeling,
Mm.
which I associate with the kind of intensity or frustration or like irritability of the Aries moon
Mm.
experience. So just slowing down, even in this podcast, I've I noticed I've had a tendency to kind of speed up, and so just kind of recognizing that and learning
Mm.
to kind of put more, I guess, red flags and bring in more tools of when to use. Uh, I guess the red flags would be there to indicate when to use the tools. So,
Mm.
because sometimes with being having an Aries moon, I can really get involved in the moment and
Mm.
not realize when I'm getting more escalated or uncomfortable. And
Yeah.
so it's really been a process of kind of having that recognition and then bringing in the tools of breathing or sinking in
Right.
to my body. And at the same time, bringing in exercise or just physical movement. Uh, it's something that I've heard recommended for Aries placements a lot, and it's just very much so helpful for me, especially like something like calisthenics or sprinting or lifting weights
Mm.
have been really good. The more uh, like long distance running and whatnot, I can't handle. It just
Yeah.
I find it dreadful. But those like the exercises that are like bursts of energy have really aligned with my Aries moon and have helped kind of expend some of that extra energy.
Yeah. It's so funny thinking about my Mars placement in Sagittarius and the difference again between these fire placements of, like you're saying that you prefer sprinting to long distance. Sprinting for me is like the last thing I want to do, but like I'll go run 10 miles, and it's like almost like a spiritual experience, like bringing in those kind of like Sag connotations of like the movement of my legs. Literally, Sagittarius represents like the thighs as like a spiritual practice almost. Very, very interesting. Cool, wonderful. Yeah. So did you want to move ahead now to talking about myth?
Sure. Well, just a quick touch on you brought in like Jupiter having a big influence on like both of our charts. I will say that kind of on reflecting on my chart a little more, I did notice that my moon placement is in the bounds of Jupiter, and then
Mm,
Jupiter is also the night triplicity lord of fire, and
right.
so we have Jupiter exalted in Cancer square the moon with those placements. So there's kind of like a mixed mutual reception, which I feel like has been really supportive for my
Mm-hmm.
moon, um, especially since the moon is like squaring Saturn, which is very problematic.
Mm-hmm.
But for sure, like that Jupiter is very strong and helpful there. But yeah,
Cool.
but like yeah, to switch into the myth, the one that I just really wanted to touch on is Jason and the Golden Fleece. The Golden Fleece being associated with sacrifices to the god Aries, or
Mm,
AKA Mars, uh, and I don't have a ton of experience with the myth, but what I've learned of it has resonated quite a bit. I listened
mm-hmm.
to a podcast episode from Holes to Heavens, I
Okay.
believe by Adam Summer, and he spoke with Jason Hawley, who is a great like mythological relational astrologer,
Yeah.
and really
Love Jason
influenced.
Holly.
Yeah, he's great. His one of his Norwalk presentations on kind of like being in the consultation and like letting what comes up come up and having that kind of again relational experience has been really influential for me.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, he spoke with Adam about the myth of Jason and the Golden Fleece and how it's one version of it at least is sort of a failed initiation.
Mm,
But for sure, a lot of it resonated. There's kind of like this feeling of an impossible mission that was given to Jason that he then strived step by step to accomplish. Supposedly, he was supposed to do things that just couldn't be done, like defeating these like fire breathing bulls and
mm,
um, planting dragon teeth into the ground and then sprouting and becoming warriors that he then had to defeat. But in the end, how he completed his mission was with the help of a lover, essentially, and that resonated a lot for me because of that the seventh house activity that I have. I have Saturn and Capricorn in the seventh, as well as Venus. So like my out of sect malefic and my insect benefic together in the same sign. So
mm-hmm.
that's been an interesting experience of like the worst and the best together.
Mm,
And
yeah.
well, complicated by Venus being conjunct Uranus and Saturn being conjunct Neptune. So just like wrap your heads
Mm-hmm.
around that for a second. And then all of that square the moon. And so like definitely relationship being brought into the lunar experience has been important for me. And in some versions of the legend, Jason like basically betrays his lover who helped him, the
Yeah.
sorceress,
And her
um,
name is Medea, correct?
Medea. Yeah, yep.
Yeah. I just
Which
want to give really quickly just a shout out again to Jason Hawley because
oh
he
yeah,
also talks about this in his eighth house lecture, talking about and the focus on that is on Medea rather than Jason. And it's just a great lecture. So I'll put that in the show notes, but I just wanted to make reference to that.
yeah. I would I want to check that out myself to delve a little deeper. I like that focus on Medea. I think it's a good balance to sometimes the overly patriarchal like Aries experience. I mean, there's
Mm-hmm.
both genders or like polarities involved in like every part of the zodiac and the chart. So yeah, I appreciate that nuance and just the fact that myths are flexible. They're not like carved into stone, even though sometimes they are. But like we
Literally,
can
yeah.
be sort of co-creative too and reimagine myths. I believe in that podcast that I referenced, they discussed different versions and that were kind of gleaned from artworks
Mm.
versus versions that have been like carried down through the telling, and that was influential too because it just tells that we can rewrite our stories a little bit. We're not necessarily um, tied to one specific version of a myth, even if that myth is being brought in to our lives very strongly. So, like, part of something that it's kind of on my slate is to really dig deeply into that Jason the Golden Fleece myth and Medea, and kind of seeing where I'm embodying the most problematic parts of that myth and really being
Mm.
kind of again raw with that,
Yeah.
but also exploring what better versions of that could be, kind of alternate endings and
Mm.
re-envisionings, and seeing what other cultures bring to that sort of mythological cluster. Um,
Mm.
Definitely something I haven't done a lot with yet, but I'm really excited about, and
Yeah.
I really love like mythological work.
Yeah.
Um, I've brought in a lot of like fixed stars kind of early on into my
Mm-hmm.
astrological exploration. And I have a lot of connections as well with the star Hamal, which
Mm.
is in the constellation of Aries. So it's just kind of that much more insistent that I really kind of delve deeply into that myth.
Yeah. And I think that that's like one of the reasons I wanted to bring myth into this podcast is because of my experience watching Jason Holly's lectures, and then later on, like going on to actually, I took a class with Jason Holly on the Earth signs where we explored myth in relation to each of the Earth signs. And you've mentioned or you've alluded to like this Capricorn stellium that you have. I also have a Capricorn stellium in my second house, and yeah, I think the power of myth um, is really being able to kind of move into these as stories in like an embodied way, or what Jason might call kind of like living the dream, like kind of like living a waking dream, almost like playing with that dream. And I think that that provides so much space to really getting emotional just thinking about it, just thinking about my experiences of doing this, but to really move into those spaces astrologically, to move into those, to, try to embody those beings, so that you can create a little bit more space in the way that you're talking about, how have I embodied this in the past? Where can I go? Like what is the space to go? And I think that that's, the interesting question of astrology that I'm always interested in is like, what is fated and what is free will? Like, what can't I change and what can I change? And I found like through this mythical work, through playing with these stories and reimagining these stories, it really does create a lot of space to work with significations we have in our birth charts and find space and find meaning and find, um, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
I
there's so
don't know
much
what else.
there. Yeah, I thought of so many things when you're describing all those, and I completely agree
Mm.
with what you're saying about like the meaning making with the chart and kind of exploring fatedness and free will. I kind of see it as bringing back what little Whitehead that I have. I kind of see it as the world is sort of made of stories, and in the sense of we have the sort of eternal stories, or one could say that the stories in spirit, which are like the myths and the archetypes. And then we have our lived experience, which is like the specific uh, instantiations of those stories. And like each one is unique, each moment and experience in life. Um, However, each one does bring in specific stories and myths, and we're sort of embodying those, and those are represented within the chart. And I would say they could be expressed in many different ways.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like bringing in that term from Tarnas, Richard Tarnas, of archetypically multivalent,
Right.
as a way of looking at the chart, which I like.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, for sure. So if we're looking at that in that way, um, I also like to bring in. It comes from Druidry, my specific like studies with that, coming from more so like John Michael Greer, who
Okay.
shares a lot about like the revival Druid tradition, which started back in the primarily the 1800s. Um, but in that tradition, there's an idea of like a threefold kind of view of like fate and destiny, where
Mm-hmm.
fate is sort of similar to how we might think about karma, although
Mm-hmm.
again that's a complicated like concept that is
Right.
summarized differently a lot of times, like in English versus like its source languages and cultures. However, just the idea of there's a kind of a momentum from like past events, whether in previous lifetimes or within one lifetime, and that could be considered fate, that sort of pushing momentum like from the back. And then on the other side, destiny is a word often sort of mixed with fate,
Mm-hmm.
but in this specific view, I kind of see it as um, that which pulls us to a specific kind of direction in the future, quote unquote,
Mm-hmm.
where it's almost like the lure. In
Mm.
Whitehead's philosophy, it kind of sees the divine or God as like a creative pull towards um, like a bettering or like a more creative, co-creative being in the world,
Mm-hmm.
or almost like the divine brings a specific telos, or not even end goal, but just sort of a pull in a certain direction. And that pull, either from God or the higher self, or however someone wants to kind of think about that, could be termed destiny. And then, or corresponding with the future. So the fate corresponds with the past, destiny with the future. And then
Mm-hmm.
in the middle, we have the present moment, that kind of Aries in the moment feeling. And what's corresponded with that is the concept of will or choice. Um, will, as in um, deciding what we're going to be doing, I guess.
Right.
Like the will has a lot built into it that,
Mm-hmm.
but I recommend people to explore that as like a philosophical notion.
Yeah.
Uh, and then the idea is if any two or three of those line up, a destiny, fate, and will, um, then the person or soul or whatnot is drawn like inexorably in a certain direction. Like when we feel sort of swept away in a sequence of events, a lot of times I would attribute that to like an alignment between fate and destiny, or fate and will, or fate
Mm-hmm.
and or will and destiny. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I love this discussion that you're bringing forward because Chris Brennan and Adam Ellenboss recently talk about like fate and astrology in a recent astrology podcast episode, and I feel like this goes really well with. I mean, I was listening to it yesterday, so it's very fresh on my
Nice.
mind. So I feel like it's very interesting, the differentiation between these different concepts and how they play in. So yeah, thank you for bringing that forward. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the relationship of your moon to your sun. You know, you already talked about kind of this hot moon in Aries, but we can add even a little bit more nuance to that with the lunar phase because you have a waxing gibbous moon, correct?
Correct. Yep.
Yeah, so can you talk a little bit about that and how that plays into your experience of your moon?
Yeah. So waxing gibbous moon, also high in the sky, in the night side of the chart. So the moon is sort of rejoicing by hemisphere, and yeah, I've always been sort of fascinated by the gibbous phase, and even just the word gibbous. Um, and when I was into Lovecraft for a while. H.P.
Okay.
Lovecraft is an author, and one of he is very wordy and an interesting writer. problematic. Also, I just want to note that,
Mm-hmm.
and no one had issues with race and whatnot.
Yeah.
But he has contributed a lot to literature. Um, gibbous is one of the words that he uses, and when he notes the moon, at least several times in his writing, he mentions the moon being in that gibbous phase, which I always question. I'm like, why did he use? Isn't full moon like a mysterious phase, or even the new
Mm.
moon where it's dark?
Right.
But
So
then,
just to be clear, the gibbous phase, the waxing gibbous phase, is like that moment before the full moon. It's
right,
like,
so the moon
yeah.
is very full, but you can tell that it's not fully round. It's kind of
Mm.
I don't even know what you call that shape besides gibbous. It's like a circle with like a
It's a
slice
bit
taken out of one side.
oblong, perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And um, so learning more about the astrological significations of the waxing gibbous phase in particular started making a lot more sense. Why
Mm-hmm.
Lovecraft would have used that. I don't know if he realized it, um, but it has this feeling of being on the edge of something important, or like having this anticipatory feeling of like something's about to happen, or like you're on the edge of the void,
Mm-hmm.
or even like an anxiety of like there's the bad side too, or the more negative experience side where it's uh, dread, or like feeling that something bad might be coming. Uh,
Mm.
as someone with that natal phase, like that whole family of feelings is very familiar. It's kind of like a automatic sort of set where I feel like something is about to happen, either good or bad or neutral, or
Mm.
whatnot, and
Mm.
that's definitely my default. And so, like tying back into like that sort of supernatural horror fiction, it makes a lot of sense that that would be the phase. Like a lot of Lovecraft's work is anticipating or fearing the unknown, or the
Mm.
abyss, or not knowing, and that not knowing itself being fearful, or that feeling of like standing on a precipice. So yeah, for sure, that's like been my experience of that phase.
Interesting. And yeah, just to talk a little bit about the temperament or its elementality, I think it's either, I can never get it right, it's either Ptolemy or Porphyry who talk about the moon at that phase as like being in summer. There's this kind of seasonal relation. And so it's like, again, that idea of like right before the full bloom of the full moon, the fulfillment that's there. I think temperamentally, it's the hot and wet phase. I don't know if that's correct. I believe it's the hot and wet phase. I think the first quarter is hot and dry, and then hot and wet, and then cold and wet, and cold and dry. Hey all, this is SP hopping in with a bit of a correction on this section. So I just wanted to read a very short, brief section from Demetra George's Ancient Astrology and Theory and Practice, Volume 1. This is from page 333 on the lunar phases. It says, Ptolemy explains how the moon is more productive of moisture in its waxing from new moon to first quarter, of heat in its passage from first quarter to full, of dryness from full to last quarter, and of cold from last quarter to occultation, which is the new moon. Porphyry relates how the moon's first appearance until the first quarter is like spring, and thence to the full moon like summer, and from there to the second quarter like autumn, and next down to its disappearance at the new moon like winter. I have a balsamic moon, so I'm pretty sure that, but it just adds this, and I think hot and wet because the, if I remember correctly, those are the benefic qualities. Those are the qualities that are kind of life affirming, rather than malefic, which is like not conducive to life or the growth of life. And so again, there's this other idea of, it's kind of like, I don't know how humid it is in Indiana, but where I grew up in New York, summer is very hot and wet, it's humid, and things are growing, things are in full bloom in that time. And so I feel like that kind of adds a little bit to it as well. I don't know if any of that is resonant.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I don't know if I'm learning like a slightly different side of the tradition, or I'm just misremembering. I tended to associate the quarter from first quarter to the full moon with the hot and dry, whereas the spring sort of quarter is hot and wet. Although
Okay.
what you're saying is true of like my experience of the weather in my region here in southern
Mm.
Indiana is definitely hot and extremely wet.
I also want to say I haven't looked at that in Demetrius' first book in a while, and I could just totally be wrong. That's very much a possibility.
Well, I mean that's interesting too because I've become a little more flexible in my wrongness sometimes. Uh,
Mm.
like sometimes when I'm wrong or have like a fact that's not fully correct, my exploration of that has been still very nourishing or influential.
Hmm.
So like whether or not that quarter is hot and wet, I would want to know that specifically. However,
Mm.
what you're saying is like of my summers here, they are quite um, hot and wet. So on some level, I think that is going to have an influence of my experience of these archetypes, whether or not
Right.
like the traditional Hellenistic is hot and dry or not. So um, yeah, I think it's good that we kind of brought both of those versions in.
Hmm.
Um, because I mean summer can be dry, but I do live in a humid region, and I have associated like that hot and wet sort of humid weather with that sort of um, Aries kind of headachy feeling.
Hey y'all, SB here again, just jumping in with one more note on this. I reached out to friends on Twitter to find textual references to temperament in the quarters, and I want to thank Amy Green for responding with a image from Abu Mashar's Greater Introduction. So the quarter following the new moon is when the sun and the moon are conjunct. That is a hot and wet quarter. The quarter from leading up to the full moon is hot and dry. The quarter after the full moon is cold and dry. And the last quarter before the new moon is cold and wet.
And yeah, so like calculating either way, when I did the calculations for temperament, and I did several, it's because there's so many kinds.
Right.
I always come up as like choleric first, uh, and then phlegmatic as like a distant second. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, for sure. Like overall, my experience has been that kind of fiery, choleric uh, experience.
And just to be clear, because I'm not super familiar with the temperamental terms, choleric is like that kind of hot dry, and phlegmatic is the hot wet kind of thing.
Yeah, choleric is hot dry, and phlegmatic is cold wet.
Ah, okay. Okay.
And
Yeah,
so,
that
but
makes sense.
for me, the cleric is definitely first and foremost.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Speaking of cold and wet, your Mars placement, your Mars is in the water sign of Scorpio. So I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit more about, this very dignified Mars, and how that affects, yeah, how your moon kind of plays out.
Sure. Yeah, I love my Mars placement. I have Mars in Scorpio at the 3 degrees Scorpio, and I can sort of rattle off the dignities. It's in its own bound, its own triplicity. It's the primary triplicity lord of
Mm-hmm.
water at night. It's in its own domicile, of course, and its own decan as well. And so I don't use the medieval numbering system, but just for this, I did it, and I believe it came up to plus 11 Scorpio.
It's like super
So
Mars.
yeah, Super Mars. So I love that. I mean, I also have the sun in Scorpio, and I believe there's just like the edge of being under the beams. I believe
Yeah,
it's like
it's
14 degrees away.
so
Uh,
interesting because I only recently learned reading one of Ben Dyke's translations of Abu Mashar that there's a different, like under the beams. I thought it was just 15 because that's the kind of, I think, the moiety they call it of the sun. But for Mars, there's a different kind of like range of when Mars is under the beams, and it's 18, I believe he says. Uh, just really interesting to hear that, and also for like planets being under the beams, it's different for each planet given their nature. Like it's better or worse. And if I understand for Mars, it's like it's not as bad for Mars because the nature of Mars and the nature of the sun are similar.
for sure, and also there's the idea of like being in chariot, so like a planet in
Mm.
its own domicile, or I believe some authors even say within its own bounds. kind of displaces a lot of the difficulties of being under the beams or combust. Um, and so, yeah, my Mars feels comfortable there. Yeah, so it's so I have Mars with the Sun, and then Mercury Cazimi also in Scorpio. So like 8/12 of my chart are ruled by Mars ultimately.
Hmm.
And again, it has that kind of aversion, but like engirded relationship with the Moon, which
Hmm.
I've always thought is quite interesting. Um, just having that kind of alignment between the two signs, even without the connection. And then at the same time, I have like Jupiter and then Venus and Saturn kind of translating for Mars, kind of
Hmm.
relaying the information. So there is a connection, it's just a little more indirect,
Yeah.
that needing to be maybe activated versus it just naturally flowing is kind of how it
Hmm.
feels sometimes.
Yeah, and how do you think that Mars kind of in this inward, downward sign of Scorpio, ruling the fifth house of creativity, ruling the 10th house, a very different kind of sign, very Aries, that kind of fire up and out. How do you think that affects how the moon manifests, given the nature of Mars, where it's placed in your chart?
Yeah, I mean, it feels almost like a pressure cooker kind of situation where we have that a lot of intense internal energy
Mm,
with the scorpionic Mars, and then if there's not like an outlet up at the top, I guess so to speak, with the Moon in Aries at the top of the chart, um, like I said before, with like physical exertion or um, like how I'm doing now with trying to be more in the public, having
mm,
like a personal brand. I feel like when I'm doing those things, my whole chart, my whole life experience flows a lot better. Versus when
cool.
I kind of have my moon sort of can almost feel like turned off at times when I'm being more recluse or
Mm,
not doing as much physical activity. Then I feel like a little cut off from experience where things feel kind of uncomfortable or almost like a not rightness in my
mm,
experience. Um, so I feel like I have that need to connect with the moon, um, and like my lunar activities of being like doing 10th house things, or lunar bodily things to
mm,
get my whole chart to flow. Otherwise, I have issues, interpersonal relationship issues kind of crop up. I'm sort of there's a lot of stuff going on in the chart all the time, of course, but
mm,
just from that flow from Scorpio to Aries, yeah, it just feels like I need to consciously make those outlets happen. Otherwise, there's going to be like a buildup or like too much of the intensification internally, and then that kind of erupting and causing problems. That's kind of how it feels, at least.
yeah, yeah, totally. That makes sense. And you talked about like the planets in the seventh house transferring the light of Mars in the fifth to the moon in the 10th. And I'm curious, like, if you could speak to how that plays out maybe at all in your life. Like, how do, the seventh house can be romantic partnerships, but it can also be business partnerships. There's that open enemies signification as well. But like, yeah, how does that transfer? Do you think? How do you see that in your life?
I find that for me, the fifth house does kind of have significations of creativity.
Mm-hmm.
I know that's a little more on the modern end of things, but it
Yeah.
does feel right like the procreation is an act of creation, kind of the
Mm-hmm.
primordial act of creation, and that I feel like does translate well to like creative and artistic projects.
Yeah.
Also, I did want to note that a little side dignity maybe is that Manilius had an alternative arrangement of the joys of the planets in the houses, and
Mm.
he had Mars rejoicing in the fifth. And
Oh,
there's this great
interesting.
article that I forget the name of, but maybe I can send that over.
Yeah, please do.
Where an author kind of goes through that. I believe it's Chloe Margarita. I'll send that over and
Okay,
um,
cool. Yeah.
talking about that and how that I know Manilius can be a little more of a poetic, a little less maybe directly reliable for techniques,
Mm.
but that exploration of the joy of Mars in the fifth really felt apropos. And then that being sort of translated through the seventh house, all of those topics translated through the seventh house to the 10th, I feel like I'm best active in the public sphere when I have, or I'm like engaging the support of like my partner or like the people with whom I have close one-on-one relationships.
Yeah.
If I kind of like try to bypass that, I feel like that creates like tensions in my life. And yes, I mean, I have my moon in Aries, and there is that kind of like fierce independence and like wanting to sort of work alone at times.
Yeah.
But when I kind of lean too much into that and don't take the support of others, things don't tend to work out as well.
Right.
And like there is a discomfort there. We have Saturn, who's the out of sect malefic in and ruling Capricorn, in my seventh. And so like that doesn't feel great sometimes. It can feel like
Right.
super limiting. Sometimes I just want to like break free and like do my own thing. But when I kind of reel it in and or like subject myself and allow myself to experience those discomforts of like sometimes hearing things that I don't want to hear, or like some criticisms that can feel harsh but are ultimately quite constructive.
Yeah.
I mean, like Saturn is in Capricorn, so uh, it it can be helpful. It's because it has its resources and can do what it wants to do. Sometimes that's to my benefit, and sometimes not.
Right.
But me working with that energy, then I feel like I can unlock that Venusian assistance. Venus being pretty happy in her own triplicity of Earth at night, in that sense at least. I mean, she's also like applying to Saturn, which is
Right.
uncomfortable in its own way. But I feel like the moon can get that sort of helpful, sort of physical, embodied, being an Earth sign, Venusian assistance. So I kind of have to engage that sextile from Scorpio to
Yeah.
Capricorn, that sextile of the energy that maybe can flow if activated, but maybe doesn't necessarily naturally flow like a trine does. But when I engage that, then I feel like that square from Capricorn to Aries functions a lot better and with less of that like discomfort, even though a square is like of the nature of Mars. So
Yeah.
um like conflict and barriers or whatnot. But yeah, I feel like that flow from the fifth to the seventh to the 10th is really important for my like life experience, for sure.
Cool. Thank you for explaining. That's so interesting. So interesting to see and hear how these things play out in people's lives, because you can see it in the chart, and then hearing you explain it makes so much sense. All right. So have you tracked the cycles of the moon in relation to your own emotional life? And if so, what have you found? So what happens when the transiting moon is changing signs? How does it make you feel? What happens when the moon is in Cancer and is in your first house? Is it like wonderful experience for you? I wouldn't know. It's my eighth house. Tell me about it.
I feel like I do notice, I'll just list, I kind of rattle off the things I notice the most. Excuse me, is my lunar phase return. So, like around the time of the gibbous moon, I like that feeling. I like that time. And I've heard other people say that too, is when they kind of the moon returns to that natal phase, is like a time that feels most comfortable or whatnot. So that for sure. And then the three kind of signs that I sort of notice kind of pop out the most, depending on other configurations, of course, is the moon returning to Aries, and then Scorpio, and then Cancer as well. And then the exact feeling of that I feel like varies a lot, just depending on what other planets the moon is connecting to at that time, and probably also like personal timing things that are going on. But I do notice that like Scorpio, Aries, and Cancer, and that's my sun, moon, and rising as well.
Right.
But they're also very active houses for me as well. I just notice there are times of like high, noticeable energy. Sometimes it's difficulties or arguments or strains, and sometimes it's like just high vitality, or even like erotic energy, more so than usual, just kind of depending. And so those for sure. And then something else I just wanted to throw in and shout out to Ali Olomi. I know we both love his work.
Yep.
He shared translations of the Lunar Mansion delineations and prescriptions. And I mean, the translation he had for mine, which is the first Lunar Mansion, so like again, the most Aries of Aries. The first that's Al Sharatain or Asharatain, a little more Arabic-y, also known as El Nath. One, the translation is not super. It's one of the more challenging mansions, for sure. And I have tried the like the herbal recommendation for that. Of course, this is not like a medical recommendation for anyone else. Just something I've tried based on ancient text is black seeds. So it's like a Middle Eastern spice that's used for different things. And I just have the whole seeds that I chew on sometimes if I remember when the moon returns. And I had some right before this, just to, I know the moon's in Sagittarius, but just to kind of remind myself. And what's interesting about the experience of that is one, the black seeds are supposed to like dampen the negative influence of the sign, which I'm sorry, of the mansion, which can be some of the same things we talked about with Aries, just like discomfort or even negative sort of psychological considerations. So the seeds are supposed to help with that. And I find when I eat them, there's actually like a burning in the back of my throat that kind of lingers. And at first, I didn't like that. I still don't love it, but it's an interesting reminder that kind of keeps me in my body, like that, like little tingle or little burning. It's like it doesn't hurt. It just brings me back to the moment. And when I'm focusing on that, it allows me to be a little more intentional with like the choices I'm making or how I'm responding to the moment, which I think is a good kind of remediation for like that Aries energy where there can be a tendency to kind of be sucked into the moment and just act, or react a lot of times. I'm not saying that the benefit of the black seed is just that. However, just that sort of experiential quality to it really adheres to the fact that it is a remediation for that placement, which I love. So I just wanted to bring up that a little.
Cool. Yeah, I love that. I sometimes the remediations that are suggested, it's like stuff I don't even know what it is. I remember looking into that when we did our trade, and I was like, oh, I know what black seeds are because I use black seed oil as well. And it's so interesting to hear your experience because I don't know if I've heard other people who have like taken the suggestions and how that's landed, but I feel like that's a really interesting example of that. Wonderful.
That's something I'd also just recommend. Yeah, because I love making recommendations. Like my Jupiter in the first house, it's just is what it is to try things like that and allow the experience to speak for itself. It's something that's taken me many years to be more comfortable with. But sometimes in just sort of like having the experience and like seeing what that feels like and what that could mean on like a very personal level, it might be that no one else has ever really shared about that, but it's still very legitimate. And then if you share that experience with others, that kind of adds to our like database of like, oh wow, yeah, this is connected to this, and bringing in more significations and whatnot.
Yeah, or people even knowing there is a lunar mansion, there are suggestions for potential remediations with the lunar mansions. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that suggestion. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about in terms of the moon and your spiritual practice? I know we touched on that a little bit.
Yeah, I would just again bring up the like daily planetary prayers again, just as a great practice for anyone. It really brought me into the cycle of like a sevenfold cycle of the days. And of course, like you can go even deeper into the planetary hours and explore that. But just having that check in once a week with each of the planets, and even then, like around the time of the prayer, thinking of where the planet is, what aspects it's making to your natal chart, and so on and so forth. is a really good way of like grounding into the present astrology, and then connecting with the energies that much more. And there's a lot. Like if you just search planetary prayers, you can find some great ones. The Orphic hymns are a great one to use. And if you check out Christopher Warnock's website, I believe it's Renaissance Astrology.
Yeah.
He has a few different options for prayers that he recommends, and he goes a little further into what the practice can entail. But yeah, I definitely recommend that, and that's kind of my most specific practice associated with the moon is my Monday prayer.
Wonderful.
For sure.
Yeah, I've been trying to institute that for a while, and I'm hopefully going to try to use this conversation as a springboard to get into doing daily planetary prayer where I light a candle and read an Orphic hymn. I feel like I want to start with that because that's feels pretty doable, and just kind of get in the habit of doing it every day, because I know from my past experience that that's like daily practice is really important for me. So I'm going to try and take that suggestion. And I just wanted to give a shout out again on the introductory episode of this podcast. I read Sarah Mastros's translation of the Orphic Hymn to Selene, and I'm looking at her book on our altar right now. And so I just wanted to give a shout out to that. She just came out with a new translation or a new edition of that rather. And I'll link that again in the show notes so that people can purchase that if they'd like. Do you have any other suggestions that you want to offer to someone maybe new to astrology or a planetary relationship in forming or initiating a relationship with the moon?
Yeah, I would suggest the practice of journaling, because the moon is very kind of internal, reflective, like connected to memory, and I find that journaling, even more so than just sort of thinking about placements, when you kind of bring pen to paper or like type, do something, these kind of, I guess, physical, embodied actions, uh, and start like exploring a placement, or if we're talking specifically the moon, like where the moon is currently, what sign the moon is in, what phase the moon is in, or even like other considerations like secondary progressed moon placement and so on. Exploring those through journaling, and even asking yourself, like, what do I know about this placement of the moon? Like, what's the dignity and condition of the moon? What might this mean for me? And looking at my chart and kind of letting it play out, and writing whatever comes out. Um, for me, that's been a really great practice, where it's sometimes things that seem obvious or simple can start like unfolding in a way where it's like, wow, I didn't even know that I knew that, or that I didn't make that connection from just sort of like looking at my chart and sort of just thinking. And yeah, so definitely try journaling.
Awesome. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tony. Is there anything else you want to add, or do you have any imparting thoughts about the moon that you'd like to share?
I think we kind of touched on a lot of the main things I wanted to mention. Just that the moon is awesome. Oh, actually, there was one thing that I didn't remember to bring in, is a little practice that someone wants to try. I got this one also from author John Michael Greer. It comes from sometime in ancient Greece, in the classical tradition, uh, of greeting the celestial bodies. So like the first time within like a waking period that you see the moon, or even the sun, or the fixed stars that you kind of have a relationship with, is to kiss your palm, and then turn the palm to face the body, as just like a silent greeting of respect to the planet or body. That I really like doing that.
Cool. That's super cool. Awesome. All right, Tony, where can we find you? And is there anything that you're working on right now that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, I'm kind of doing a lot right now. Jupiter is transiting through my Aries house, so probably doing too much at once. But I have a website, starrywoodsaastro.com, where I'm doing kind of a blog, where I'm talking about all about like learning astrology, tips and tricks and techniques for kind of learning astrology in like a deeper way, or practices and ideas that can help with the learning process, that like anyone can use, whether they're taking courses or just self-studying on their own. The learning process itself can be an interesting realm to explore. And then similarly on YouTube and Patreon, both of which are under Tony of the Woods, all one
Okay.
word, where I'm kind of experimenting with podcasting and videos of kind of exploring the same topics of learning. I'm interviewing different astrologers and student astrologers about their like learning process and learning journey, and tips and ideas that they have from their experience, which has been fun. We're at episode 2 as of now.
Yeah, I listened to that first episode with our mutual friend Rabobo and really enjoyed it. So I definitely suggest people listen to that, and I'll definitely link all those things in the show notes for sure.
Oh, thank you. And yeah, my approach has been very kind of Aryan, I guess, which I don't like that adjective, but it's the one that
Yeah,
we have for
it's not the
Aries.
best.
But I kind of I'm putting a lot out quickly and then adjusting. So I hope to kind of evolve my blog and podcast and refine over time. And so hopefully listeners will enjoy that kind of growth and experience as well. And then finally, you can find me on Twitter at Tony of the Woods, where I share similar things on learning and some goofy things as well. Try to have fun with other astrologers. So definitely follow me, and I'll probably follow you back as well, and interacting.
Wonderful. Awesome. Thank you so much, Tony, for coming on and talking about your experience. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I had a great time.
To support the show by donating or becoming a member, please visit my website, which is linked in the show notes. And please subscribe to the show wherever you listen. You can also find me on Instagram and Twitter. See those links in the show notes as well. If you have any questions or feedback on the show, please feel free to contact me via my website or email me at sphallhorary@gmail.com. In the show notes, you can also find links to astrologers and resources that we touched on in this episode. Thanks. See you next time.